Everybody, welcome to the second event of the 2025 Heilbroner Center for Capitalism Studies lectures. My name is Will Milberg. I'm professor of economics, director of the Heilbroner Center. I want to say that as a former dean, I can tell you how hard it is to get 5 or 6 people together on a Friday at the new school. So this is, you get a sense of how impressive this is to bring all of you here, and I'm glad you're here. This is part of a class that I'm teaching called The Political Economy of the Corporation, and I want to welcome all of my students, and I want to encourage them to be engaged in the question and answer session that will follow the discussion. Today we feature one of the leading economic sociologists of our age, Professor Fred Block, Professor Emeritus at University of California, Davis. He has written on issues as broad as economic and political theory, as applied as global finance, industrial policy, the care economy. He has edited versions of Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation, written a beautiful introduction to that work. He wrote a book on Polanyi, The Power of Market Fundamentalism, Karl Polanyi's Critique. Other books include The Origins of International Economic Disorder, one of my favorites, Post-Industrial Possibilities, and Capitalism, the Future of an Illusion. His latest book is the topic for today, The Habitation Society, Creating Sustainable Prosperity. It is not a breezy programmatic proposal in response to the present political moment, but it is a deep treatment of social capacities, social needs, rooted in decades of scholarship on Marx, on Weber, on Polanyi, on commodification, on decommodification, on consumption, on investment, on the relation between states and markets, and on contemporary social theory, on identity and the environment. I'm just very pleased to have Fred here and that we can feature this book. I'm also very happy to say that we are joined by many of Fred's colleagues from the editorial board of Politics and Society, where Fred has served for decades, so I'm so glad you were able to make it, and welcome. We have a very dynamic panel of discussants, and I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we'll go straight through with no interruptions. Natasha Lennard, they're out of order there, is the Associate Director of the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism Program at the New School for Social Research. She is a columnist for The Intercept. Natasha is the author of a number, or co-author of a number of books, including Violence, Humans in Dark Times, and Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life. Welcome, Natasha. Bhaskar Sunkara is the founding editor of Jacobin, president of The Nation magazine, and the author of The Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. And on my left, Fraser is Nancy Fraser, the New School's own Henry and Louise A. Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics, one of the most foremost political theorists of our day. She needs very little introduction here at the New School. I will mention only her most recent book, Cannibal Capitalism, How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It. Fraser is the recipient of the Alfred Schutz Prize for Social Philosophy, among many honorary degrees and other awards. So we will first hear from Professor Block, who will briefly introduce us to his book, and then we will ask each of our discussants to speak before we open it up for questions from the audience. And I will just tell you that after we're done, Professor Block will be available for a book signing at the table on the side. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to our featured speaker.
Well, okay. Thank you for the kind introduction, Will, and for organizing it, and thank you to the all those people who've worked with you to put this together. Thank you to the panel for agreeing to do this. I'm honored by your presence, and thank you all for coming. It's been a long time since I've talked to a room with this many people. And I guess I'll I'll say at the beginning that I kind of come to you as a reconstructed relic of the social movements of the 1960s. And I think you'll see in what I have to say kind of relics or echoes of the rhetoric of that period, and particularly the focus on participatory democracy, which was a central theme for students for a democratic society. So let me say at the beginning that we're meeting against the backdrop of an authoritarian attempt at a coup in Washington, D.C., and the truth is that I don't have a lot of wisdom about how to resist. So, what I would say is very similar to what even centrist Democratic senators are saying at this point. Get in the streets, protest, write letters, make phone calls, gather with other people, engage in civil disobedience, and fight back as hard as we possibly can. But I would stress that we as people of the left have kind of two tasks. One is to fight back against the right, resist the erosion of democratic governance and democratic norms. But we have another task as well, which is to generate visions and strategies of where we need to go in the future so that we can rebuild a majoritarian political movement for fundamental reform in the society to realize the promise of a multiracial democracy. So that's what I'm going to try to do by kind of summarizing the book in, how do I do this? Yeah, so I'm going to try to summarize the book in 7 slides, and we'll see how this goes. So the starting point, my starting point is that the kind of original sin of mainstream economics is its insistence that it's developed general principles and ideas for managing any kind of economy, regardless of what it's producing. And this is summarized in a quip that's attributed to Michael Boskin, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for George H.W. Bush, and he denies he said it, but he did say it. Computer chips, potato chips, what difference does it make? $100 worth of one is equal to $100 worth of another. And my fundamental argument is that the practices, the policies that make an agricultural economy work are very different from the policies and practices that make an industrial economy work. And by the same token, the policies and practices that make a post-industrial economy work are very different from those that make an industrial economy work. So starting from that premise, I'm arguing that what many of us used to talk about as a post-industrial economy, one where manufacturing employment had shrunk dramatically, where most people worked in the service sector, where computerization and knowledge were becoming central to the whole process of production, that one of the way that we could now understand that concept of a society that comes or an economy that comes after industrialism is to call it a habitation economy. And here I'm kind of deliberately using an old-fashioned word to describe something new as a way to give it valence. But the basic idea, the basic insight is that in our current economy, most people's employment is in providing, maintaining, changing the soft and hard infrastructure of the communities in which we live. So the built environment, housing, office buildings, retail stores, the health sector, which is increasingly large, the education sector, which is a substantial share of employment, other services, retail trade, local government, that these are all part of the habitation economy, and it's where the bulk of people are employed. But that I take the concept of habitation from Karl Polanyi, and in The Great Transformation, he talks about a fundamental conflict between habitation and improvement, and by improvement, he means technological advance. And he argues that throughout the last few, or 4 or 5 centuries at least, there's been a fundamental conflict between improvement and habitation, that the enclosures in England, for example, increased agricultural productivity, but they did so by disrupting the habitation of the people the rural people who depended upon grazing their animals on the commons. So the idea is that this is a long-standing conflict which intensified in the industrial era, and we see that, with great industrial cities like Detroit and Manchester that go into decline when the industry moves somewhere else in search of higher productivity and lower wages, destroying the habitation that people had constructed over generations. And so my point is that in the current reality, where all of us consume habitation and most of us produce habitation, we have the potential to overcome this historic conflict between habitation and improvement. We could be using our technology to create more sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and vibrant communities, but we're not doing so. In fact, the conflict between habitation and improvement grows ever worse. We have a housing affordability crisis on a major scale. We have health systems which are dysfunctional. We have climate change and a deteriorating environment. I could go on and on. You get the point. And so my argument is that the reason that we're not able to overcome that historic conflict between habitation and improvement is because we're continuing to govern our economy, our society, according to the rules and institutional structures that we inherited from the industrial era, and that we need to radically change those in order to realize the potential to move from having a habitation economy to having a true habitation society, where in fact we overcome this conflict between habitation and improvement. Okay, so the story is that the next 4 slides represent chapters in the book that are illustrations of the ways in which our inherited frameworks, procedures, rules prevent us from realizing this potential. So the first is that modern economics is built, including Marxist economics, is built around the concept of the commodity. But what they meant by a commodity were standardized goods produced by many different firms that were exchanged in a single moment in time. And that's important because the whole idea of consumer sovereignty, of consumer choice making a significant difference, was rooted in the ease of exit. Think of the farmer's market where there's 6 booths that sell tomatoes. You might have been going to one booth for quite some time, but it turns out that they gave you some squishy tomatoes at the bottom of the bag. It's costless to say, almost completely costless to say, okay, forget that booth, I'm going to go to this other booth to get my tomatoes. But so here's the rub, that almost all of the things that we consume now do not fit that definition of classical commodities. They are things which are non-standardized or produced only by 1, 2, 3, 4 different firms, or are transferred over an extended period of time, like your subscriptions to various streaming services or whatever. And the point is that that shift from standardized to destandardized has the consequence that exit becomes much more problematic, that you don't like your health insurance company, they're not doing a good job, your ability to exit from them, maybe once a year you could possibly exit, although probably your employer has only signed up with one. Across the whole spectrum of things that we consume. And so what that's done is essentially shifted the market, shifted market power strongly in favor of producers and away from consumers. And so that's a very substantial part of the story, that we've given these firms greater power. We have less control over the things that we consume, less ability to use our purchasing power to get what we want. And obviously, a part of this is many of the key elements of habitation are elements of collective consumption, like education, like health, like urban amenities, and so forth, that again, don't fit kind of within this framework of commodities. So the bottom line there is that we're depending upon the market because of this abstract theory that made some sense in an economy based on commodities. Okay, so the next point is that our economy is still built around the giant multi-divisional firms that arose in the industrial era because they were good at producing standardized goods. But it turns out that they're not particularly good at either innovating or producing destandardized goods. And so what one sees across the economy is a shift to what I call cooperative network production. So in the automobile industry, for example, 50 years ago, the big auto companies produced 80% or more of the value added that went into a car. Now they contract out for 70, 80% of the value added for the car. Or Hollywood studios don't actually make the movie. It's networks of producers and technicians and so forth who make the movies. The studios then market them. Or in the pharmaceutical industry, Big Pharma rarely develops a new medication other than to extend the patent on an existing one. They depend upon startup firms, but that the problem for the startups is that the cost of the clinical trials necessary to get FDA approval is so great that they end up cutting deals with Big Pharma to get through the trials. Wait. Stop. Oh, okay, I'm fine. I don't know, I didn't really set it for, to do that, so it's obviously tampering by the Chinese. So the point is that the continued domination of these corporate dinosaurs is the worst of all possible worlds, because they siphon off a huge part of the profit stream, and yet they also inhibit substantial innovation that would happen if we had an economy which was more open, more supportive of small and medium-sized firms, which is where the the innovation comes from, as I've tried to show in other research. Okay, the next point is that a big problem, it comes in the way we define and measure investments. And here I'm talking about how investment is measured in the national income accounts that developed by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is the agency that gives us the figures on how large our GDP is. And so the story is that in these accounts, they're built on the assumption that households do not invest. Everything that households spend is consumption. And kind of from the beginning of the accounts in 47, as a kind of simplifying measure, they said even if homeowners have built their own house, we're going to treat that investment in the house as though the business sector made it. And we're going to treat those owners as renting from themselves. That mentality has continued. So homeowners get no credit for building houses, renovating their houses in the investment category. But it's also the case that their purchase of consumer durables like automobiles or dishwashers also doesn't count as investment when it's manifestly an investment. I mean, you buy your car because it's going to provide you with a flow of transportation services over multiple years, sometimes 10, 20 years. The same purchase of a car by a business is counted as an investment. But the most important point here is that even though economists have been blathering for 60 years or more about human capital and its importance to the economy, by which they mean the expenditures that improve the skills and capacity of the labor force, those expenditures are still not included in the national income accounts as far as I know, in any economy. And the reality is that what we spend on education, child care through postdocs is huge as compared to the expenditures for physical things like machines and buildings. So what I do in the book is essentially do a rearrangement of the accounts that essentially based upon taking seriously the feminist arguments about the importance of the reproductive sphere, the importance of unpaid labor in the home, and so forth. And so I can only kind of give you the tagline here, but when in the official data for 2019, which was a year I used because it was the last year before COVID, and so it was easier to use, that in the accounts in that year, business accounted for 84% of investment, government for 16%. When I do my recalculation, business accounts for only 29%, government, households, and nonprofits account for 71% of the investment in the economy. Now, the point of this is that all of the austerity arguments is that we can't have nice things as consumers, and we must shrink government and get all of those federal employees to quit as quickly as possible because we need to maximize the profits that go to the business sector so they will make the critical investments that sustain our prosperity. But I'm saying all of that is fundamentally wrong in a habitation economy. It's households and government that are making the bulk of the productive investments that make our economy more productive over time. So they have it exactly backwards. Okay, so the last of these points is about the financial system, and I think I can be very brief here. The basic idea is that the financial system that we've inherited from the industrial period is designed to direct money to corporations, so our retirement savings gets poured into stocks and bonds. But the reality is that the corporations in aggregate are self-financing. They give back money to households. And in recent years, they're engaging in something like $1 trillion a year in stock buybacks that were illegal until Ronald Reagan's administration. And those stock buybacks primarily fundamentally benefit the corporate executives themselves because they pay themselves generous stock options and stock grants. So at one level, the financial system sucks money out of the economy to go to the 1%, and this financial system is underfunding, is failing to finance clean energy, affordable housing, the infrastructure that we need, and so on, small business, innovation, and so forth. So I'm going to wrap up here. So essentially, my solution, the positive vision, is that we need to democratize the production and consumption of habitation. We need to give people a much greater voice in deciding what their communities look like, what their services that are available to them look like, what the built environment will look like. And to do that requires two major structural reforms. The first is to change the financing system, because state and local governments in the US, but across the developed world, have been starved for resources for decades and decades and decades. And that has turned local politics into a kind of zero-sum game where each neighborhood is fighting against other neighborhoods to get crumbs from the table. So we need to dramatically expand the resources available at these local levels through federal revenue sharing on an even larger scale than in the 1970s, and also create public financing institutions that would lend money to localities, to states, for infrastructure, for services, et cetera, et cetera. And along with that, we need to build stronger participatory institutions to give people a greater voice over the habitation that they have. So, for example, I talk in the book briefly that we've always had elected county school boards that oversee public education. Why don't we have elected county health boards that have a tremendous amount of authority over the delivery of medical services in the county that can regulate and respond to the needs of people to make the healthcare system more responsive. But I don't want to suggest here that the federal level is unimportant. The federal level remains important. We need, for example, for federal supervision to make sure that local communities are using these resources in ways that deconstruct established racial hierarchies rather than perpetuating them. We need the federal government to engage in vigorous antitrust. We need the federal government to create a fairer tax system that makes the billionaires pay their share. But my focus here is that we need a huge amount of bottom-up organizing to organize people at the local level, at the state level, in order to bring together people to engage in this process of reconstructing their habitation. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Does that work? No?
No, I don't think that was it.
Oh. I did click it up.
Here.
We're going to start with Natasha, and then Bhaskar, and then Nancy. Do you have a microphone?
How's that? Is that, okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Block, for writing this important book and joining us today. And thank you, everyone, and thank you to my comrades, comrade discussants, and for Will for organizing. So, when I was reading this book, I had this quite fanciful desire to travel back in time at various points, or maybe some sort of counterfactual thinking or different possible worlds. Maybe I wanted to storm in holding the book to a meeting between Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden in the first half of his presidency. No, you've got the numbers wrong, and you've got the framework wrong. Stop this anti-China bellicosity, stop this production economy. That's not what the economy is. We live in a habitation society, behold. But sort of what am I saying? Professor Block was already writing about these sort of things then. So were brilliant thinkers like Gabriel Wynant at the University of Chicago in his fantastic study of the Rust Belt's shift from the industrial economy to the care economy. I stayed fanciful, though, because it's really hard to think straight in this day and age. So what if I went back in time and I kidnapped Hayek and Friedman? Maybe Luigi Mangione wants to come with. He can time travel too. And so the post-industrial theorists that Professor Block mentions, who started thinking around the same time about the fact that even though not to the same care economy extent we live in now, we already necessarily lived in somewhat of a habitation society. It was just not recognized in the accounting of the governance that hands so much to corporate power and property owners. So time travel itself started to feel silly, and it always is, partly because it pretends that a set of knowledges or some sort of understanding possessed by just enough specific individuals would be sufficient to have changed the course of history. Me storming into any of these rooms, even with Luigi Mangione, wouldn't have done the trick. The structure of the conjuncture in which any moments of such revelation or possible rupture occur are, as we find ourselves now, all too burdened by entrenched power relations. And of course, Professor Block notes this. Such a course correction would meet tremendous pushback from the extraordinary powerful billionaire beneficiaries of this system and the state machinery with which they are wholly entangled and served by. Professor Block notes this indeed, and notes that this didn't happen all at once, but through a series of aggregate moves, power grabs, modes of narrativization of the economy and accounting, all informed by political material conditions of possibility, which inform those conditions in turn. We could name a few: Taft-Hartley, Citizens United, the set of things we call Reaganomics, NAFTA, the very decisions of how we categorize investment, as Professor Block noted, the enclosure of the Commons, some creep at Harvard making a website to judge how hot girls are. I do want to thank Professor Block for bringing our attention to the work, as he's done previously with his earlier work too, to Karl Polanyi, because that is, I think, particularly a useful thinker to be in conversation with at this moment, given that he so clearly saw the connection between the destructive tendencies of free markets and the state action that they rely on. These are planned economies. Any laissez-faire economy is. And then the rise of fascism in the 20th century. And we can see that continuity of liberal capitalism and fascism alive very much today. The move to talk about Habitation Society, to attend to social reproduction in the legacy of Marxist feminists, and in the amazing Professor Fraser, for sure, and in recognition of today's economic realities, is crucial. The concept encompasses at least significant aspects of what Professor Fraser calls the hidden abodes of capitalism. That's why I wanted to speak before Nancy, so that she can answer things that I have questions about. And the 500 years of capital's global racial empire, and the hidden abodes that those have ordered and relied upon. Unwaged housework, social reproduction of labor, destruction of habitats and environments, the natural world, and indeed the political authority on which extraction and circulation of profit depend. I suppose I want to raise the question, and I definitely don't feel equipped to answer it, but I know my panelist comrades here are, about the risks of this sort of expansive category, the category of habitation as the terrain of production and reproduction, or productions and reproductions, if there's a line to be drawn there at all. You point out, Professor Block, that such a distinction isn't really reflected in today's economic realities in the way it previously could have been more cleanly divided. Perhaps such lines are genuinely blurred if they were ever particularly stable. But I wonder if there's a risk of losing sight of the contingent historical processes that have brought us here, of colonialism, expropriation, exploitation, and racial and gender division, the specific ways capitalism has taken shape and shaped the world in turn. Does one big category risk obfuscating the ways capitalism entailed and depended on those divisions, and continues to? Does it risk overlooking the ways reproduction has always depended on the unequal valuing of lives, conducted according to race, sex, gender as well? I don't think it necessarily does, but I raise it as a question. The increased democratic control overseen by benign government referees, which is what we would need for having this Habitation Society coming into recognition and flourishing, limits on the profit motive. Are those sort of non-reformist reforms, to use the terms, a term popularized by Ruthie Gilmore, sufficient to challenge class society as such? And gosh, doesn't it all seem so far away? Another question. Polanyi was correct in observing, I believe, the connection between free market economy and fascism. I'm really grateful to the work of my just former colleague, Clara Matai. She just left the New School. Her brilliant work tracing the links between the political economy of British late 19th century, sorry, 3 minutes, I can do it, late 19th century austerity and fascism. Polanyi lived to see the exceptional post-war boom era and the seemingly settled compromise between capital and labor. He didn't see its radical undoing, the return of free market fundamentalism in the form of neoliberalism, but we have that hindsight. So do we have reason to ask whether capitalism can be tamed in a way that some of these non-reformist reforms suggest? 2 critical points, potentially. It's a book about habitation, and it speaks often about the desperate need for affordable housing and the corporate-state nexus that has foreclosed its construction. But it only mentions the term property in the book in terms of intellectual property. Of course, I'm completely in agreement with what we need to do to rein in predatory landlords and the industry-state relations that enable the housing crisis we have. But as we see in this very second, we leave ourselves at extraordinary risk around the limits of private capital accumulation, if something so necessary as housing is only kind of regulatively or legislatively ameliorated. The real question is, can there be participatory democracy and democracies with the inherent inequality entailed in property relations and capitalist relations of production in place? I submit that our horizons require some abolitionist vision too, which is why I will end saying, for a call which I am also invested in and support for participatory democracy. I mean, I came of radicalization at the Occupy era. It was about then when I met Bhaskar. Can we have these discussions and begin to get off the ground with an immediate reckoning, without an immediate reckoning with our carceral state? You open the book with Gramsci and the famous line about our morbid symptoms. We can't forget Gramsci wrote those while in a fascist prison cell. You do note that Trump's opponents might fear prison, and they are right to, perhaps. But if we're talking about localized democracies, whole localities in this country are prison company towns. It is a system of non-stop anti-black disenfranchisement and working class segmentation. And without beginning with, or at least very least demanding and working on a process of mass decarceration, I don't see how the question of democracy gets off the ground, localized or not. And it's those struggles against the carceral system, against landlords, against border rule, for bodily autonomy, for gender liberation. These are habitation struggles. They are already underway, embattled as they are, relating to the forms of life we collectively make and remake, often against extraordinary odds. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm actually surprised that I just met Professor Block for the first time, because I spent years reading his work. At first, I encountered it trying to understand the relationship between the state and capitalism, and his work on the subject disabused me of, at the time, maybe you could say excessively Leninist understanding of the state. And then it was through Fred's work that I first encountered, or first introduced to Karl Polanyi. So needless to say, I'm very honored to be asked to talk about your book. I have lots to say about its merits. I prepared way too many notes, so I'm going to skip all the niceties and focus only on some points of criticism. But I do highly recommend that everyone read the book. Because even though it doesn't use this language explicitly, the Habitation Society is fundamentally a democratic socialist book, in that it advocates for greater levels of economic democracy. It advocates for the erosion of capitalist power in our society, and the creation of collective prosperity based on the fulfillment of human needs above the needs of profit. So now, lots of criticism. So at the start of the book, just like at the start of his lecture, Professor Block includes a bit of his impressive biography and his experience with the New Left of the 60s and support for the emphasis on participatory democracy. So this criticism is somewhat of an aside. But I'm someone who believes in that emphasis. But I want to quickly point out some of the contradictions that flow from that starting point that I don't think are fully examined. So I'll quote from the book briefly. It is the exception rather than the rule that decisions about infrastructure, such as the location of highways, mass transit, high-speed rail lines, airports, or even parks, are made through some kind of inclusive deliberation. People also lack much influence over a critical part of habitation, the location and availability of affordable housing. So I think it's actually in these particular areas mentioned that we see real problems with, you could say, the bastard childs of the participatory democratic framework, and the dangers of applying these principles even more widely in our society. So one reason, for example, why we have such a massive housing shortage in this country, particularly in big cities like New York, and one reason why public transit is so limited and hard to expand, is because of the number of veto points in U.S. society. So we see here that democratically legislated zoning laws, land use regulations, public hearings, community processes, environmental and historical preservation laws are widespread manifestations of democracy, but at the same time they're used to stall construction that would benefit working class people. The big caveat to this is I am a socialist, even though this sounds like a paid for lunch break by some developers in New York City. But participatory democracy and public hearings attract today disproportionately middle class people, professional class people with time in their hands and a particular class interest as small stakeholders in society. Small homeowners, for instance, that have interests that are distinct from either that of capitalist developers or a lot of working class renters. So this applies to the same big construction projects like the creation of high-speed rail lines. So in countries like Spain, you could construct rail at 1/3 the price of the US. In Spain, the labor used to construct that labor is more heavily unionized than the US. So I would pose that the difference in the Spanish structure and the American veto's points is that they have democracy, but it's through mass democracy. Working class participation comes through large unions that are large stakeholders, or working class participation, historically at least, in mass parties, rather than the sort of associational democracy with the veto points in US society. That's all to say that I think there is a more complicated reckoning that we need to figure out between reconciling technocratic expertise and democracy in any society a capitalist society that we're reforming, or even a post-capitalist society, because I think, sometimes as socialists, we understate the extent to which there are many other contradictions other than the contradictions of class, and there's many things that democracy is not a cure-all for. So this gets me to a broader overarching criticism of the book, which is just my questioning of whether economic shifts to a broadly post-industrial society warrant such wholesale revisions of this traditional socialist goal and emphasis of worker control of the means of production. So I read enough on the state that my views on the state have changed, but I haven't been totally disabused of my Leninism. So, in other words, is our old language insufficient? Are our old goals foolhardy? Or are we just politically defeated? Should we revise just what's necessary, but not more than what's necessary? So the Marxism we inherited from Marx, Engels, and the Second International clearly had deficiencies, some of which were addressed by the work of scholars like Professor Black. We're lucky to have Milberg, Palensis, Block, Jessup. Now I'm getting into deep cuts. Professor Black's a much better writer than all those people, actually. Just at the level of prose, I will say. The ruling class doesn't rule is still assigned to every incoming Jacobin intern. And I read it, actually, as an 18-year-old in the break room at a Key Foods grocery store. Before I joined the ranks of the professional middle class, I could just walk out of the office, didn't tell anyone where I was going, going to come back in 2 hours. It's a better life now. So I'm not talking about offering a rigid defense of Marxist theory. Marxism is a framework that has to evolve, but I'm talking about socialism as it existed and was practiced in its two major forms, both social democratic forms and state socialist forms. Since fundamentally Professor Black is laying out a vision of an egalitarian society that's fit for socialist ambitions, and he correctly describes in the book social democratic, and I'm paraphrasing, social democratic and communist roads as kind of being blocked. So fundamentally, to me, the work seems to underemphasize the fundamental antagonism between capital and labor, in part because it's a revision of the emphasis on production and the emphasis on business. But as soon as you downgrade the emphasis of business, you're actually also downgrading the emphasis of the privileged place in society that workers have producing value. I think that we could get into a lot of the failures of social democracy, but I think that a habitation economy wouldn't necessarily resolve the fundamental contradiction that arises from capital's means of production, including the ability of capital to withhold investment. And I think the failures of social democracy, a lot of it stems from that problem. But I think if we do need to revise socialist practice and replace our vision of socialism with something else, we should look at the failures of state socialism, and which did give us an alternative model of political economy. So how did the Soviet style or other forms of state socialism fail? Obviously, there were democratic defects. These were authoritarian party states. This is where I think being a small d Democrat as a matter of moral and ethical principle is important. This is where it's important that we repel against the kind of technocratic or millenarian kind of impulse to treat people as expendable in pursuit of some greater goal. And again, this is where really believing in democracy is important. But at an economic level, state socialism failure was rooted in many contingent factors, but I think a lot of them boil down to incentive and coordination problems. So in the 1980s, the Soviet economic bureaucracy consisted of 38 state committees, 33 all-Soviet ministries, 28 Republican ministries, and more than 300 regional ministries and authorities. Each of these nearly 400 organizations had sprawling bureaucratic departments within them, and together they oversaw 43,000 factories, 26,000 construction enterprises, 47,000 farming units, 260,000 service establishments, and over 1 million retail trade shops. The factories alone produced 12 million variants of different products and product variants. So that's just the factories. So as Professor Black's work mentions, products are getting even more complicated, even more non-standard. And to me, this means that we as socialists have to accept that our starting point needs to be, we have to find a way to keep the market as a coordinating mechanism and make it work with our egalitarian goals. So you can imagine, I'll just need 30 seconds so I don't end like a neoliberal. So we can imagine, for example, one, having some sort of key sectors nationalized with democratic inputs, rail system, health system, telecoms, things like that. We could imagine having much of the rest of our economy run by competing firms, with firms democratically controlled by their workers and owned by a network of public banks. So finance, of course, would have to be socialized. And within this regulated market sphere where firms are created and fail at a rapid phase, it would need to be cushioned by a decommodified welfare state to produce socially necessary goods. And I think this is where our views are aligned. But I do think that fundamentally, we need to start with the premise that as much as our economy is changing, we need to start with the starting point of profitable firms produce value. They produce it on the back of their workers, but they produce value. These firms provide jobs. These jobs and firms provide tax revenue. And fundamentally, our economy only works with profitable firms, whether the firms be worker-owned or owned by capitalists. So it doesn't start with households and governments. And I think from that point, we can imagine that it would be, if we want to really plan more of our society or decommodify more of our society, we'd be better off from a condition of abundance and profitable firms producing surplus, hopefully not with worker owners, and hopefully not in the back of workers, rather than imagining kind of decommodifying and creating a more caring economy, Habitation Society, in the context of a shortage economy, which will only create the politics of resentment and venial competition between different groups within the democratic polity.
It's on? Okay. Great. So I'm also really happy to be here. The book is quite fascinating, and the comments that we've heard are already very exciting, and I'm going to try to build on some of those and some things that Fred said. I think, first of all, I want to say how much I appreciate the opening framing of this book, which invokes Gramsci, invokes the concept of an interregnum with morbid symptoms, and like Gramsci, attributes these morbid symptoms to the blockage of a transition, of a social transformation. Some of you may have recently heard Adam Tooze reject that whole framework, and I think without good reason at all. But this, I'm really happy to see Fred using it in a very creative way. So this framework raises three central questions which are addressed in the book. We're talking about a block transition, right? First, what is it a transition to? Secondly, what is blocking it? And third, how do we overcome the blockage and get the transition moving again? I want to suggest that Fred gives a very promising answer to question one, what is the transition to? So I think I'm more favorable maybe than Bhaskar is to that notion, although I have plenty of questions about it. I want to say that his answer to question two, what is blocking it, confuses me and seems to need a little more discussion or thinking. And question three, how do we get there? What does the transition look like from a political point of view, an organizational point of view? I feel that the answer is quite partial. So let me just say, I think you might remember this, Fred. Everything I'm about to say about these three questions and these three answers can be sort of put under a slogan, which is actually a title of an old essay I wrote, Why Two Carls Are Better Than One. And I recall how much you hated this idea when I presented it at a meeting of the Polanyi Society years ago. But I do think that two Carls are better than one, and the problem is how to put them together. So, Fred's answer to the first question, what are we transitioning to? And I very much like the idea I think of it as a sort of left Hegelian idea that the transition is already happening in some partial and distorted form. It's imminent to the movement of history. This is very good. His answer to what it is the Habitation Society. And I have to say there are lots of things that I like about this idea. One thing that came out in your remarks that I hadn't fully seen before, the concept of habitation, I think, really scrambles the familiar dichotomy between production and consumption. Because when people are consuming, they're also at the same time producing forms of life and forms of wealth, actually. And it's also about bringing into the foreground a set of practices and wealth-generating activities, including work, some recognized work, some unrecognized work, that is usually backgrounded in capitalist societies because of the monomaniacal focus on exchange value. Okay, that is all very good. Now, habitation, Fred defines as the creating, maintaining, and improving of the soft and hard infrastructures of the communities in which we live. So there's this whole, and it's interesting because we have a lot of talk today about infrastructure, and including the caring infrastructure. And there's this big sense that the foreground activities of the capitalist economy right, are obscuring something else that makes them possible. This is the hidden abode idea that Natasha mentioned. So this I like very much. However, I do want to say that when Fred gets a little more specific about what counts as habitation and what doesn't, I feel we're in a kind of a hodgepodge. So we have things like all the things that feminists call social reproduction, childcare, healthcare, housing, and so on. But we also have energy production, which I guess includes both like drill baby drill, but also what some eco-feminists would call earthwork, the work of repairing and maintaining habitats. Then we also get transportation and communication, entertainment. So somehow this category has, it's not quite coherent for me, and I hope we can say more about it. Because Fred also defines it in terms of how much work that goes on in the economy is actually habitation work. And there you equate it with service work, which includes everything from financial sectors and insurance claim deniers, right, to, to maids in hotels and offices and childcare workers and nurses and doctors. So again, I think the issue is how to get clearer about the distinction between the sort of necessary and useful social function that you're trying to describe and the ways in which it's misshapen and deformed in, well, I will say capitalist society. Okay. So anyway, more clarification about the concept is needed. Now, but assuming we could get clearer about that, then I think the question is, what is the relation of a habitation society, as you understand it, as the desirable, if not final endpoint, at least provisional endpoint of the current transition? What is the relation between that and capitalism? Can there be a habitation society within a society that we would still call capitalist? What is its relation to social democracy, a form of capitalism presumably, to democratic eco-socialism, and so on and so forth? And it seems to me, a little bit of evasion here. So I don't know whether a habitation society is like a transitional socialist program to somewhere else, or whether it's, the final, what do they say it in the international, the final? Okay, battle. Now, what is blocking it? Fred's answer is industrial era thinking and institutions, and he gave you some examples of those. Some questions here. First of all, industrial era, specifically, I know that all your examples, have to do with large corporations and so on and so forth, but but again, the question for me is it industrial era, or is it something deeper about capitalism, about the dynamic of capital accumulation? And I would put my money, such as it is, on the second, actually. I don't think that if we got post-industrial thinking, but kept the sort of dynamic of capital accumulation über alles, that we would get where we wanted to get. Secondly, the second question is the balance between the industrial era thinking and the institutions. Now, and this might be an issue that's also a problem in Polanyi's Great Transformation, a kind of intellectualization that is putting a lot of weight on the ideas that people bring to, and of course for Polanyi, it's the marketizing forces with their great new free market thinking, and here it's conventional economics and the ways. So of course the question there then is really how those ideas are materially implanted. It's not just ideas. The ideas are important, don't get me wrong. I'm not like an eliminationist, materialist or anything. But how do they become real practical forces? And I would say we need to hear more about the rules of the road, the property order. These are the sort of the materialization of those ideas that actually license, and more than license, incentivize large economic actors to basically, to use my word, cannibalize habitation, nature, and so on and so forth. Sorry, okay, let me just, and here's an example. I think, a related example. I think you overestimate the power of consumer choice, specifically in the industrial era. I would say that real counterpower in that era, echoing Bhaskar, is organized labor. And that's something that's kind of missing from this analysis. So I don't have much time. How do we get there? And again, the absence of organized labor is important to me with this problem of how we get there. So you talk about connecting the dots, that if we could sort of disseminate this idea of a habitation society, and that the various social movements involved in different struggles, potentially emancipatory movements, could all understand that they were all fighting to democratize habitation, then we'd have the basis for a nice big coalition that could become majoritarian. That's quite interesting, and something that I've tried to do in a different way. But I have a self-criticism of my own work, which is also a criticism of you. It's too cognitivist. We assume that if you connect the dots for people intellectually, then that becomes affectively mobilizing and motivating. Whereas, look at our enemies. We have to talk about the other side, after all. They've got something that they don't have the cognitive. We're much better at that. But they have something that's apparently even stronger, and that is identity. They have the idea, we know who the people are, and we know who the non-people are. And this is really so affectively powerful. So partisans of a habitation society or of a democratic eco-socialist society or whatever, what do we put up against that? Yeah, I have 0 minutes. This is the problem of bifurcation, the Carl Schmitt problem. Who is the us and who is the them? I think we have to have that. I'm not a Schmittian, believe me. But that's part of the Gramscian picture. My money is on a much more class, the issue of class divisions, and how to think about a broader idea of what the working class is that includes all those habitation workers that are not usually counted as workers. Thank you.
So we started 10 minutes late, so I'm gonna say that we're gonna go 10 minutes longer than is on the flyer. So stretch. If you don't have a seat, there's, for some odd reason, a line of seats over here that are free if anyone wants a seat. I think we should give Fred a few minutes. I would like to limit it to 3. Is that crazy? And because we have so many people here with such strong interest in a great set of comments and a very far-reaching set of comments that I think we need to bring the audience in. So 3 minutes either there or up here.
Okay, well, is this working? Yeah. So I appreciate everything said, and that gives me a lot to think about since I only have 3 minutes. So yes, I'm aware of class power, that capitalists exert a great deal of power. The right exerts a great deal of power. So I'm thinking, I'm starting from the reality, one part of which is college-educated voters are increasingly part of the Democratic base. Non-college educated voters are increasingly part of the Republican base. How do we, our problem as a left is creating languages and practices that will begin to bring those people together. I don't believe that, that for the most part, people in what the Ehrenreichs called the professional managerial class actually live off the exploitation of the rest of people. I believe that there's a possibility of creating a majoritarian force that brings them together. And so the habitation language, and I'm throwing it on the wall, see what sticks, but is a way of trying to think about how we could use that. And again, think about our big cities, where roughly 80% of people vote for the Democratic Party coalition. We have a kind of, so if we could begin, so a lot of the impulse around the focus on habitation is to get an emphasis on building power at the local and the state level, because the left coalition, including Bernie Sanders, I think has been too much focused on the federal level and imagining that getting control in Washington, you could pull some levers, as Biden did, throw out a lot of money, and that would solve the problem of transforming the economy. And I think that's wrong. I think that we need to build from the bottom up, democratically, participatorily, and that's the impulse. And yes, that these tensions around growth curbs and veto points and so forth, I don't have the solution to all of that, but I think that with more resources, a lot of those, that it would be possible to bring together technocratic knowledge and participatory knowledge, have competing plans on how the city will redevelop its transportation system, that you can build and sustain coalitions that cut across existing lines of race, ethnicity, social hierarchy, et cetera. And I guess lastly, I'll say that theoretically, kind of working in the tradition of my late colleague Eric Wright, talking about how do we erode capitalist power? How do we develop a strategy that exerts greater control over institutions, gains greater control over the economy, to gradually erode capitalist power so that there's a transition over a sustained period of time that builds up obstacles to reversal and to the restoration of class power.
Okay, we're going to open it up. We have a bunch of microphones that we're going to pass around. And so hands can go up. I don't know. Hands should go up. Maddie, you want to help me? And I want to thank Maddie for doing all the work to pull this together. Maddie Sullivan is the student assistant at the Heilbroner Center for Capitalism Studies. So Maddie and I will hand out microphones as the hands go up in the room. I see a lot of, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess my question was, we see with both the Trump administration and Biden that they're trying to get industrial jobs and things like that back into the United States. So I guess my question is, do you think that it's possible that they're going to succeed in some kind of slight reversal of the habitation economy, because they're kind of trying to go back to industrial? Or do you think that I guess the proverbial genie is loose, or the Pandora's box is open with habitation? What do you think the effects of these new industrial-focused efforts are going to be about habitation society and kind of trying to have a true habitation society versus just a habitation economy?
Great question. Why don't we collect a few, and then we'll see who wants to respond.
Thank you very, very much. I'm basically a foundational kind of thinker. My background is architecture. And I've always wondered, I don't know what the definition of capitalism is anymore. I don't think capitalism in the true sense is practiced any place. To cut it short, some of you might remember, looking around, a department store called Cy Sims department store, and his motto was, an educated consumer is our best customer. That applies to everything, not just clothes. So the idea of separating the consumer, the productor, the business, there's no foundation. The building starts with the foundation, and an educated consumer is our best customer.
Can you pass that down to, thank you.
Hi, yes. First, thank you for all speaking. This is an amazing panel, and thank you for opening it up to people outside of the New School. This is fantastic. And so some of the comments that were made kind of get at the power of business to kind of disinvest at any given moment, right? And so I'm just wondering, and kind of that's one of the main ways that capital is able to exercise power over the government, over labor, et cetera. I'm wondering, given kind of the recalculations that you do, in which you look at investment by different social groups and find that essentially business only makes up a really small proportion of investments, what does that mean for the structural power of business? And why is it still reproduced regardless of the relatively weaker position than people often assume?
Let's take two more, and then we'll turn it back to the panel. Go ahead.
Hello. Wait, was his question answered, or am I ready to go?
Go for it.
Okay. So, Professor Block, I feel like gigification as a labor alternative with built-in protections like portable benefits, and the FTC has started regulating gig employee protections and allowed these workers to claim stabilized incomes. And we are now seeing work-owned platforms like the Drivers Cooperative and Up and Go that show that gig work can be restructured to redistribute profits and provide financial stability. I do want to know that since even in its best form, gig work remains unstable and cannot replace the need for public investment, infrastructure, healthcare, and stable employment, as you mentioned, what actually stimulates public investment in these sectors? And can we balance that with a gigified economy without eroding stable jobs feasibly?
So this discussion was post-industrial economy and focused on what's coming next. With the great leaps forward we as a society have made in technology, specifically AI, robotics, stuff like that, how does that empower or erode workers' role in society? Does it change? How do you think a possible habitation society looks with these new advancements in technology in 5 years?
Okay, let's turn it back to the panel. There were 5 comments from the floor, and we'll take another round. If anyone, you want to start, Fred?
Sure.
This one's missing.
Okay. So First on the manufacturing, I mean, was very supportive of the Biden administration trying to bring chip production and electric cars and batteries and so forth back here. I think the key thing is that with very few exceptions, most of those factories that are being built are going to end up, with employment of maybe 200 to 1,000 people. In other words, the great factories of the industrial era often, employed 50,000 people, 70,000 people. We're not going to see that coming back. So the impact on the structure of the labor force is going to be small. I'm not sure how to respond to the what is capitalism, but I will say on the structure power of business, a part of my point, and I developed this argument in the edited book that I did with Robert Hackett on democratizing finance, is that if we create the kind of public nonprofit financial institutions that are needed, and that grassroots movements are building, like the Public Bank of the East Bay and the Public Bank of Los Angeles, that we could in fact have, in combination with the argument I was making about the investment pattern, we could have effective response to capital strike. I mean, that the structural power of business could in fact be dramatically reduced, because you would have public banks that when private banks slowed down their lending, those public banks could take up the gap. And so the traditional structural power of capital could be effectively countered. I guess I see the gig economy as pretty much, one of those morbid symptoms. I mean, that obviously, people make use of it because they're financially squeezed. Make use of the jobs that because they're financially squeezed. But there's absolutely no reason that those couldn't be transformed into stable jobs with predictable hours. And again, with the public investment, AI in the future. I mean, again, that what I would say is think back, to the 1990s and the promise of the internet, that all human knowledge would be at our fingertips. We would have a utopia, and what do we have instead? Vast amounts of misinformation, social crisis for teenagers who are being, bullied and told that they're too fat. So if we continue on the current trajectory, I think that that we can come up with a whole bunch of horrible visions of the way in which AI will be used to make people's lives more miserable. But the point is that that's a choice that we can make as a society, and we could figure out ways to contain and control and use the technology in ways that improve people's lives.
Any other panelists want to make a brief response to the? Go ahead, Nancy, Bhaskar, Natasha.
Yeah, I want to respond to a few of the questions, but also to something Fred said just before, and let me start with that. I'm very skeptical about this sort of notion of gradualism that you invoked before, that, we start small and then gradually over many years we expand, blah, blah, blah. Do we actually have time for this? Number one. I mean, we're really headed off a cliff, and the time frame is not huge. Also, I mean, I don't actually think that that's how social transformation happens, by, inching along. I think that there are these sort of critical moments when, it hits the fan, so to speak, and people leap into action. We're kind of in that sort of moment now. They've just leapt into the wrong action. And there hasn't been a strong enough voice, despite all of Bhaskar's heroic efforts, to, chart another path, and the effort in your book as well. Okay, so the comments I wanted to refer to, the return to manufacturing. I think what people want when everyone talks about return to manufacturing. I don't think it's really about manufacturing. They want stable union jobs that are sufficient to support a household, where they're not precarious, where they, have a livelihood that is adequate for a decent life. I think it doesn't really matter so much what you're doing, whether you're growing food or making widgets or taking care of patients in a health facility, but that's the sort of issue. So I think this does relate to that question about precarious work. Will Trump bring back manufacturing? No, that's clear. Okay, I don't think we need to belabor that one. But how long will it take for his supporters to realize that they've been bamboozled, or will they ever? That's a pretty important question. Okay, thirdly, on AI. I think that the real question here is about time. We need time for habitation. People working long hours in multiple jobs don't have time to take care of their households, their families, to do community work that produces the kind of non-commodified wealth in the life world. And the promise of robotics and AI should have been free time, but in fact, under capitalist conditions, it doesn't lead to that. It leads to degraded living conditions that require more hours of paid work per household. As soon as you introduce this problem of free time, then the question is time for what? And this is why I kind of bristled about the way you included entertainment in habitation work. It depends, of course, what entertainment means. But, commodified, pre-packaged leisure, is as alienated, I would say, as most alienated labor.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, and I think I would love to get another 2-3 questions from the audience, and then have a wrap it up. Hands. There's one in the back. Thank you, Maddie. Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question. Is it working? Can you hear me? Hi, Fred. About how I haven't read the book yet. I'm planning to, but so maybe this is addressed there, but it didn't come up in the conversation just now. Many people have argued that one of the problems with post-industrial forms of economic activity is that they're inherently less productive than manufacturing was, or than even agriculture turned out to be, with the productivity rises that occurred in its development. And I'm wondering how that fits into this whole set of discussions, because if that's true, doesn't it present, it sort of aligns with what Bhaskar was arguing, that, you need profitability in the end to make the whole system work. So I'm just wondering what you think about all that. Fred in particular, but others as well.
Yeah.
Thanks. I was asking myself, I didn't hear about the alternative wealth indexes in your thinking. I was wondering if it was playing any role in acknowledging or taking into account this household and state contribution to the global wealth. So I don't know if it's present in the book, but I'm afraid. Thanks.
One more? Anyone dying to make a comment before we wrap up? Okay. It's all yours, Fred.
So that, to Ruth, that, they used to say that you couldn't have an economy built around a service economy because it would just be people taking in each other's laundry. And my point is that when you squeeze down the number of people who are in the manufacturing sector, you can have an economy where most people are taking in each other's laundry, and it doesn't matter, if they have levels of productivity which are comparable to the to manufacturing. But the deeper point is that it's manufacturing, which is the home, the base for capitalism. When you're talking about these services like healthcare, or you're talking about the internet, it doesn't really make sense to have that in the hands of private firms. I mean, it could just as well be socialized, provided publicly, whatever. So that's why I think that, there is, in the development of capitalism itself, an erosion of its structural power. And I'm arguing, let's take advantage of that by bringing people's attention that they are creating the economy themselves through what they're doing for each other. And that's the basis to build a movement in which we gain control over that economy. And wealth index, I don't know. Yeah.
Why don't we end on that nice note? Thank you to the panelists and to Fred Block.